When Thomas Borden extended credit to a desperate widow and her bright-eyed son in his modest Charlestown shop, he never imagined the impact of his simple kindness. Decades later, as news arrives from America about the remarkable rise of Alexander Hamilton, now a founding father of a new nation, Borden's son receives an unexpected letter that will connect two families across oceans and generations. But the real surprise isn't just Hamilton's remembrance of an old debt, it's what he carried with him from boyhood to the heights of power. A small token that reveals how profoundly a single act of compassion can shape history. Before starting this incredible journey through history, make sure to subscribe to Loom for more extraordinary stories and updates in F1. Thomas Borden wiped sweat from his forehead as the Caribbean sun beat down on Charlestown. His small grocery shop sat at the edge of town, where the cobblestone streets gave way to dirt roads leading to sugar plantations. The wooden sign above, his door, weathered by sea air, simply read, "Borden's Goods." Inside, Thomas arranged sacks of flour and sugar on rough wooden shelves. At 45, his red hair had begun to gray at the temples, and years of island sun had left his pale Scottish skin freckled and lined. Still, he moved with energy as he prepared for the afternoon customers. "Good day to you, Thomas," called Mrs. Wilson, the wife of a plantation overseer. She placed a basket on his counter. "Just the usual today." Thomas nodded and began to gather her items. "How are things at Mount Ravers?" he asked, referring to the large plantation where she lived. "The same. Always busy." She counted out coins from a small purse. "You heard about the hurricane heading toward Antigua? Hope it stays far from us." Thomas had heard. Weather news traveled fast between islands, especially bad weather. "Let's pray it does," he said, packing her purchases. After Mrs. Wilson left, Thomas opened his ledger. The rows of names and numbers told the story of his 10 years on Nevis. Some accounts were marked with red ink, debts that might never be paid. Thomas sighed. He'd been too kind with credit at times, and his own suppliers in England weren't nearly as forgiving. The bell above the door jingled as a young dock worker entered. "Afternoon, Mr. Borden. Got any of that salted fish left?" Thomas smiled. "Just got a fresh barrel yesterday, Michael." As the afternoon wore on, a mix of customers came and went. Plantation workers buying rum and tobacco, house servants collecting supplies for their masters' kitchens, sailors seeking provisions for their next voyage. Thomas treated them all the same, with a quiet dignity often lacking on an island where a person's worth was too often measured by the color of their skin or the size of their purse. The sky darkened as storm clouds gathered. Thomas lit oil lamps that cast a warm glow through the shop. Rain began to patter on the wooden roof, and he wondered if he'd see any more customers today. The door opened, letting in a gust of rain-soaked wind and a thin woman clutching the hand of a small boy. Both were drenched, their clothes, once fine but now worn, clinging to them. Thomas recognized Rachel Fawcett Hamilton. Her reputation on the island was complicated. Born to a planter's family, she had married and left a wealthy man, then lived with another man without marriage. Such scandals followed her, though Thomas paid little mind to island gossip. "Mrs. Hamilton," he said with a respectful nod. "Come in from the rain." Rachel pushed her son forward, closing the door behind them. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, but his eyes were sharp and watchful. "Thank you, Mr. Borden," Rachel said. Her voice carried the hint of an education better than most on the island. "I'm sorry to arrive so late." "Not at all. How can I help you today?" Rachel hesitated, then spoke quietly. "I need some basic supplies: flour, beans, salt fish, perhaps a bit of sugar." She paused. But I find myself in a difficult position. The money I'm expecting. It hasn't arrived from St. Croix. Thomas knew what was coming. It wasn't the first such request, and hurricane season always brought hard times. I wonder, Rachel continued, her voice steady despite the shame coloring her cheeks, if I might make purchases on credit until next month? I can pay a fair interest. Thomas glanced at the boy, who was examining a jar of imported candies with careful attention, as if studying its properties rather than simply wanting its contents. "And what's your name, young man?" Thomas asked. The boy turned, standing straighter. "Alexander Hamilton, sir." There was something in the way he spoke, a pride and intelligence that seemed beyond his years. "Do you attend school, Alexander?" Thomas asked. "My mother teaches me, sir, and I read whatever books I can find." Rachel placed a hand on her son's shoulder. "Alexander has a quick mind. He devours books like other children devour sweets." Thomas nodded, making up his mind. "Mrs. Hamilton, I'll extend you credit for the essentials you need. You can settle the account when your funds arrive." Relief washed over Rachel's face. "You have my word, Mr. Borden. We will repay you promptly." As Thomas gathered the items, young Alexander approached the counter. "Mr. Borden, do you have any newspapers? Even old ones?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You read the news?" "Yes, sir. I find it fascinating to learn about the world beyond Nevis." Thomas reached under the counter and pulled out several week-old papers from England and the colonies. "I was going to use these to wrap packages, but if you're interested..." Alexander's eyes lit up. "Thank you, sir." Thomas added the papers to their purchases at no charge. As he recorded their debt in his ledger, Thomas watched Alexander carefully fold the newspapers and tuck them inside his damp shirt for protection. There was something unusual about the boy, a hunger not just for food, but for knowledge. "The rain has let up," Rachel observed. "We should hurry home. Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Borden." "My pleasure, Mrs. Hamilton. Mind you keep well. There's sickness going around after these rains." Rachel nodded, but Thomas noticed the slight flush on her cheeks wasn't just from embarrassment. She already looked unwell. After they left, Thomas stared at the new entry in his ledger. Hamilton, R, 6 shillings, 4 pence. Something told him this wouldn't be their last visit. Over the following months, Thomas's prediction proved true. Rachel would come to the shop, sometimes with Alexander, sometimes sending him alone. Each time the debt grew slightly, though Rachel always made small payments when she could. Thomas began saving newspapers and book pages for the boy, impressed by young Alexander's questions and observations. Despite his circumstances, the child displayed an understanding of trade, shipping, and politics that men 3 times his age often lacked. One evening, as Alexander was leaving with a small sack of provisions, Thomas asked, "How is your mother today?" A shadow crossed the boy's face. "Not well, sir. The doctor says she needs rest, but she worries too much to rest." Thomas nodded and added a small jar of honey to Alexander's package. "For her tea, no charge." Alexander looked up, his eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears. "Sir, I promise I will repay everything someday. Every penny." Thomas waved away the comment. "Just take care of your mother, boy." As he watched Alexander hurry away through the dusty streets of Charlestown, Thomas wondered what would become of such a bright mind on this small island. Little did he know that this simple act of kindness, extending credit to a desperate family, would one day connect him to one of the most remarkable stories in a new nation's history. The news spread through Charlestown like wildfire on a dry day. Rachel Hamilton had died in her bed, leaving her 2 sons orphaned. Thomas heard it from Mrs. Wilson, who stopped by the store early that morning. "Such a shame," she said, shaking her head. "Those poor boys, first abandoned by their father. Now this." Thomas's heart sank. He had suspected Rachel was seriously ill, but had hoped she might recover. "What will happen to the children?" he asked. "The older one, James, is apprenticed to a carpenter. He's nearly grown. But the younger one—" She paused. "Alexander," Thomas supplied. "Yes, that's the one. Brilliant little fellow, they say. No idea what will become of him. They have a cousin on St. Croix who might take them in." Thomas closed his ledger, his mind on the bright-eyed boy who had come to his shop so many times over the past year. "When is the funeral?" "Tomorrow at noon." They couldn't wait longer in this heat. Throughout the day, Thomas found himself distracted, thinking of young Alexander. The boy had always been serious beyond his years, but how would he manage this? Loss? Thomas remembered losing his own mother as a young man, and he had been 20, not 13, with a father still living. The next day, Thomas closed his shop at 11 and walked to the small cemetery at the edge of town. Only a handful of people had gathered: a few neighbors, the local minister, the doctor who had attended Rachel in her final days, and the two boys. James, the older brother, stood tall and grim. Beside him, Alexander remained perfectly still, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the simple wooden coffin. Thomas noticed how the boy held himself with rigid control, as if afraid that showing any emotion might cause him to shatter completely. The service was brief. The minister spoke of mercy and resurrection, though his words seemed hollow in the face of such misfortune. No one had many memories to share of the complicated woman Rachel had been. Her life on Nevis had been one of isolation and struggle. When it was over, people drifted away quickly. Thomas approached the boys, who stood alone by the fresh grave. "I'm very sorry for your loss," he said quietly. James nodded stiffly. "Thank you, Mr. Borden." Alexander looked up, his eyes dry but filled with a pain that made Thomas wince. "Mother spoke well of you, sir. Your kindness meant a great deal to her." Such formal words from such a young boy. Thomas placed a hand on Alexander's shoulder. "If there's anything you need before you leave the island—" "Our cousin has arranged passage to St. Croix for us," James explained. "We leave in 3 days." Thomas nodded. "Come by the shop before you go. I'll prepare some supplies for your journey." Later that afternoon, Thomas was surprised when the bell above his door rang and Alexander entered alone. The boy carried a small bundle and a book. "Mr. Borden," he said, "I wanted to speak with you privately." Thomas came around from behind the counter. "Of course, Alexander. Please, sit down." He gestured to a stool near the window. Alexander didn't sit. Instead, he placed his book on the counter, a well-worn copy of poetry, and opened it to reveal several coins hidden inside. "This is everything I have," he said, his voice steady. 3 shillings and 6pence. I know it doesn't cover our debt, but I want you to have it." Thomas stared at the small pile of coins. He thought of his ledger, where the Hamilton debt now stood at just over 20 shillings, a sum that included medicines he'd procured for Rachel during her illness. "Alexander, please, sir, I know it's not enough, but I promise you this. I will pay the rest someday. Every penny." There was such fierce determination in the boy's eyes that Thomas didn't have the heart to refuse. He carefully took the coins. "Very well, I'll mark it as a payment received." He pulled out his ledger and made the notation while Alexander watched intently. "How much remains?" the boy asked. Thomas hesitated, then decided on honesty. 17 shillings, 4 pence. Alexander nodded solemnly. "I won't forget," Thomas closed the ledger. Alexander, listen to me. Your mother's debt. It's not something you need to carry. You're a child facing a difficult journey. I'm not a child, Alexander replied with surprising force. And a debt is a debt. My mother taught me that. Thomas studied the boy. There was something remarkable in his sense of honor. His refusal to accept charity even when fate had dealt him the cruelest hand. "Where will you go after St. Croix?" Thomas asked. "I don't know," Alexander admitted, "but I won't stay on the islands forever. There's nothing for me here." Thomas nodded. He reached under the counter and pulled out a package wrapped in brown paper. "I prepared this for you. Some food for the journey and a few other things." Alexander looked at the package, hesitating. "It's not charity," Thomas said quickly. "Consider it an investment in your future." Slowly, Alexander took the package. "Thank you, Mr. Borden. There's a notebook in there," Thomas added, "for your writing, and some newspapers from the colonies. They say interesting things are happening there. Talk of changes, new ideas." Alexander's eyes brightened slightly. "I've read about it. The colonists are questioning British rule. Smart lad. Keep reading. Keep learning." Thomas surprised himself by adding, "The colonies might be a good place for a bright mind like yours." For the first time that day, Alexander's rigid posture softened slightly. "Perhaps it will be." They stood in silence for a moment, the Scottish shopkeeper and the orphaned boy, connected by something neither could fully articulate. "I should go," Alexander said finally. "James is waiting." "Of course." Thomas walked him to the door. "Good luck to you, Alexander Hamilton." The boy looked up at him one last time. "I will repay my debt, Mr. Borden, and I will never forget your kindness." With that, he was gone, a small figure hurrying down the dusty street toward an uncertain future. That evening, Thomas sat alone with his ledger open before him. He stared at the Hamilton entry for a long time. Finally, he dipped his pen in ink and wrote beside the remaining sum, "Debt forgiven. Mother deceased. Children orphaned." Thomas closed the book firmly. He had written off the debt, but something told him that Alexander Hamilton would not forget so easily. There was a fire in that boy, a determination that transcended his circumstances. "Maybe someday," Thomas murmured to himself as he blew out the lamp, "we'll hear of that young man again." But even in his most optimistic moments, Thomas Borden could never have imagined just how far Alexander Hamilton would go, or how their paths would cross again through time and memory. 30 years passed like the tide washing over Charlestown. The small port town changed little, while the world beyond Nevis transformed dramatically. Thomas Borden had aged gracefully in his island shop, his red hair turning completely white before he passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 75. His son William now stood behind the same wooden counter, serving the children and grandchildren of his father's customers. At 42, William had his father's height and kind eyes, though his skin was darker from being born and raised under the Caribbean sun. "Morning, Mrs. Collins," William greeted the plantation manager's wife as she entered the shop, now called Borden's General Store. The modest grocery had expanded over the years to include clothing, tools, and medicines. "William, have you heard?" "The news from America?" Mrs. Collins asked, placing her basket on the counter. "Another letter from your sister in Philadelphia?" William smiled. Mrs. Collins often shared news from her sister who had married an American merchant. "Yes, and it's all anyone talks about there. This Treasury Secretary, Hamilton, I think his name is, has convinced their Congress to take on all the war debts of the individual states." She shook her head. My sister says her husband thinks it's brilliant, but many are furious. William paused as he measured coffee beans. Hamilton, you say? Yes, some immigrant from the Caribbean, apparently. Quite the rising star in their new government. William wrapped her purchase carefully. Do you know which island he's from? My sister mentioned it once. St. Croix, perhaps. Or was it Nevis? One of these small islands, certainly. After Mrs. Collins left, William found himself thinking about the name. Hamilton wasn't uncommon in the islands, but something tugged at his memory. That evening, he climbed to the small attic above the store where his father's old papers were stored. William had heard stories about his father's kindness to many islanders during hard times. Thomas Borden had been well respected for his fair dealing, even with those who couldn't always pay. William remembered one story in particular, about a bright orphan boy his father had mentioned several times over the years. After an hour of searching through dusty ledgers, William found what he was looking for. His father's careful handwriting recorded Hamilton, R., debt forgiven, mother deceased, children orphaned. The entry was dated February 1768. Could it be the same Hamilton? William wondered aloud. Life continued in its rhythm on Nevis. William thought little more about the Hamilton coincidence until one morning in 1795 when a ship arrived carrying mail from America. Special delivery for Borden's store, announced the postman, handing William a letter with an unfamiliar seal. William examined the expensive paper and the careful handwriting on the envelope. It was addressed simply to Proprietor, Borden's Grocery, Charlestown, Nevis. Breaking the seal, William unfolded the letter and began to read, Dear Sir or Madam, I write to inquire if the establishment once owned by Mr. Thomas Borden still exists, in Charlestown. During my childhood on Nevis approximately 30 years ago, Mr. Borden extended credit to my mother, Rachel Fawcett Hamilton, during a time of great need. Though I was but a boy when I left Nevis, I have never forgotten this kindness. It has been my intention for many years to settle this old debt with appropriate interest for the considerable time that has passed. If you are a relation of Mr. Borden or have purchased his establishment, I would be most grateful for a response, confirming the receipt of this letter. You may write to me at the address below. Your humble servant, A. Hamilton, Treasury Department, United States of America. William read the letter twice, then a third time. His hands trembled slightly. The orphaned boy his father had helped had indeed become someone important. Important enough to write on paper bearing the seal of the American government. It can't be, William murmured, yet the details matched perfectly. The timing, the mother's name, the circumstances. The poor boy from Nevis, whose mother had died and left him orphaned, had somehow risen to become the Treasury Secretary of the United States of America. William shared the letter with his wife that evening. What should I do, Martha? What if it's some kind of trick? Martha read the letter carefully. The paper alone is worth more than someone would spend on a prank. And who would pretend to be this Hamilton fellow to pay a debt no one has remembered? For 30 years? But why would such an important man remember a few shillings owed to a shopkeeper after all this time? Martha smiled. Your father always said that boy was special. Perhaps this is why. William wrote a reply the next day, carefully explaining that he was Thomas Borden's son and now ran the family business. He mentioned his father's fond recollections of young Alexander and explained that the debt had been forgiven after Rachel Hamilton's death. Though father considered the matter settled, William wrote, he often spoke of your promise to repay him someday. He admired your determination. He sealed the letter and gave it to the captain of a merchant ship bound for Philadelphia. then tried to put the matter from his mind. After all, a man as important as a Treasury Secretary surely had more pressing concerns than an old debt to a Nevis shopkeeper. Weeks passed without response. William began to wonder if his letter had been lost at sea, or if perhaps the whole thing had been some elaborate misunderstanding. Then, on a rainy afternoon when few customers braved the weather, William heard the door open. The postman hurried in, shaking water from his hat. "Special package for you, Mr. Borden," he announced. "Captain says it came directly from New York with instructions to deliver it immediately." William accepted the small wooden box, wrapped carefully in oilcloth to protect it from the sea voyage. A letter was attached to the top. With the postman watching curiously, William opened the letter first. "Dear Mr. Borden, your response brought me great pleasure. To learn that Thomas Borden's establishment continues under his son's management feels like a connection to my youth that I feared lost to time. You mentioned that your father forgave the debt after my mother's passing. This generosity only increases my desire to honor the obligation. While no payment can truly represent what your father's kindness meant to a desperate orphan boy, I have enclosed a draft for £50, which I hope you will accept as settlement of the original debt with interest. I have often reflected on how acts of credit, both financial and moral, shaped my understanding of honor and obligation. These principles have guided my work in establishing the financial systems of our young nation. Please accept my deepest thanks for maintaining the connection to Mr. Thomas Borden, whose small act of humanity has remained with me through war, hardship, and the unexpected turns of fortune. With sincere gratitude, Alexander Hamilton." Inside the box, William found the bank draft, £50, an enormous sum that far exceeded any debt his father might have extended to the Hamilton family. There was also a small book, Report on Public Credit, with an inscription, "To the family of the man who taught me the true meaning of credit, A. Hamilton." William stood in silence, the package in his hands, as rain drummed on the roof of the store his father had built. Somehow, across the expanse of ocean and time, the orphaned boy had kept his promise. That evening, William shared the story with neighbors who gathered at his store to escape the storm. They marveled at the tale of the local boy who had risen so high, and at the fact that he had remembered such a small kindness across decades. "My father would be proud," William said quietly, "not of being repaid, but of being right about that boy's character." Little did William know that this unexpected letter was just the beginning. The connection between the Borden family and Alexander Hamilton, a connection forged through a simple act of credit during hard times, would soon grow in ways nobody on the small island could possibly imagine. The story of how Alexander Hamilton journeyed from Nevis to America was one few people knew in its entirety. Even as he stood beside President Washington in Philadelphia, the capital of the new United States, Hamilton rarely spoke of his humble beginnings. "The cabinet meeting will begin shortly, Mr. Secretary," an aide informed Hamilton as he stood by the window of his office, quill in hand. At 40 years old, Alexander Hamilton cut an impressive figure. Though not tall, he carried himself with confidence. His reddish-brown hair was now powdered in the fashion of important men. His eyes, still sharp and intelligent, had seen a revolution, fought and won. "Thank you, James," Hamilton replied, gathering his papers. "Is Secretary Jefferson arrived yet?" "Yes, sir. He and Secretary Knox are already with the President." Hamilton nodded. The relationship between himself and Thomas Jefferson was tense at best. They disagreed on almost everything about how the new country should be governed. Jefferson believed in the rights of individual states and farmers. Hamilton believed in a strong central government and banking system. As Hamilton walked to the meeting room, he passed a mirror and straightened his necktie. Sometimes he still found it hard to believe how far he had come from that small shop in Charlestown, where he had once begged for credit so his mother could eat. President Washington looked up as Hamilton entered the room. At 63, Washington was still imposing, the hero of the Revolutionary War, and now the first president of the United States. Hamilton. Good. We can begin, Washington said. Jefferson sat across the table, his tall frame leaning back in his chair, watching Hamilton with wary eyes. Secretary of War Henry Knox nodded in greeting. "Gentlemen," Washington began, "today we need to discuss our trade policies, particularly regarding the West Indies." Hamilton felt a flutter of interest. He had been hoping to address this very topic. "Mr. President," Hamilton said, "I have prepared some thoughts on improving our trade relations with the Caribbean islands." Jefferson frowned. "I thought we were focusing on European trade this quarter." "The West Indies represent a significant opportunity," Hamilton explained. "I have personal knowledge of the region that might prove valuable." Washington nodded. "Proceed, Hamilton." For the next hour, Hamilton outlined his vision for establishing stronger commercial ties with the islands, particularly the British West Indies. He spoke of sugar, rum, cotton, and how American goods could find markets there. When the meeting concluded, Washington asked Hamilton to remain behind. "You spoke with unusual passion about the West Indies," the president observed when they were alone. Hamilton smiled slightly. "I was born in Nevis, sir, as you know. I still feel a connection to the islands." Washington studied his Treasury Secretary. "Is there something specific drawing your attention there?" Hamilton hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Recently, I've made contact with the son of a merchant who once showed great kindness to my mother and me, a debt of both money and gratitude that I've waited many years to repay." Washington's stern face softened slightly. "Personal debts can weigh heavily, even amidst greater concerns." "Indeed, sir. And in this case, the experience shaped my understanding of credit and debt, principles I've applied to our national finances." The president nodded thoughtfully. "Then perhaps your personal connection serves the nation as well." Later that week, Hamilton sat at his desk late into the night. Instead of working on financial reports, he was writing a personal letter. The address on the envelope read, "Mr. William Borden, Borden's General Store, Charlestown, Nevis." Hamilton had been pleased to receive William's response to his initial letter. Now he wished to establish a more personal correspondence, to learn more about the family of the man who had shown him kindness when he had nothing. "Dear Mr. Borden, your kind response to my letter has brought me great satisfaction. While I am pleased you accepted the draft in settlement of the old debt, I find myself curious about your father's life after I left Nevis and about your own circumstances on our native island. You may have heard accounts of my journey after departing Nevis. Some are true, others exaggerated. The simple version is this: after moving to St. Croix, I worked as a clerk for a trading company. My employer and other businessmen recognized something in my abilities and collected funds to send me to America for education. I arrived in New York in 1773, just as the colonies were beginning to consider independence from Britain. When war came, I joined the Continental Army and eventually served as General Washington's aide-de-camp. After the war, I practiced law in New York and helped write our Constitution. Now, I find myself with the weighty responsibility of establishing financial systems for our new nation. I draw upon lessons learned in the counting houses of the Caribbean, as well as from men like your father, who understood that sometimes credit is not merely financial, but a matter of human trust. I would be most interested to hear how Charlestown has changed. Does the old tree still stand by the harbor? Has the hurricane damage from 1772 been fully repaired? Do people still gather at the square on market days? More importantly, I would like to know about your family. Do you have children? What are their interests and prospects? I find as I grow older that connections to home, though I left it behind long ago, carry unexpected meaning. If it is not too forward, I would be pleased to establish regular correspondence. The mail packet from Philadelphia now sails to the islands monthly. Your friend, Alexander Hamilton, sealed the letter and added it to the diplomatic pouch that would leave for the Caribbean the next day. As he did, he thought about the remarkable journey that had taken him from a desperate orphan to one of the most powerful men in a new country. Few people in America knew of his origins. He had worked hard to distance himself from the poverty and scandal of his childhood. But somehow, reconnecting with the Borden family felt like reclaiming a small, important piece of himself. The part that remembered what it meant to be hungry, afraid, and shown unexpected kindness. In the months that followed, Hamilton and William Borden exchanged several letters. Hamilton learned that William had 3 children, and that the oldest son, Thomas, named after his grandfather, was showing an interest in books and numbers that reminded William of the young Alexander who had once visited their shop. With each letter, Hamilton shared more stories of his rise in America, while William described life on Nevis. Though they had never met, a friendship formed across the ocean, connecting the world's newest nation with the tiny island where its Treasury Secretary had begun his improbable journey. During a cabinet meeting about international commerce, Hamilton made a specific recommendation. I believe we should establish a direct trade route between Philadelphia and Charlestown, Nevis, he suggested. Jefferson raised an eyebrow. Nevis? It's a tiny island with little strategic importance. It exports excellent sugar and cotton, Hamilton replied smoothly. And establishing such a route would demonstrate our interest in developing relationships with smaller ports, not just the major ones controlled by European powers. Washington, who knew of Hamilton's personal connection to the island, gave a slight nod. Make the arrangements, Mr. Secretary. 2 months later, the first American merchant ship sailed directly from Philadelphia to Charlestown. Among its cargo was a small crate addressed to William Borden. Inside were books for William's children, recent newspapers from America, and a note from Hamilton expressing hope that this new trade route would benefit Nevis's economy. And so, the Treasury Secretary of the United States used his considerable influence to strengthen ties with his birthplace, all because a shopkeeper had once extended credit to a desperate family. As Hamilton's star rose in America, the stories of his childhood on Nevis began to spread. Some visitors to the island now asked to see the place where Alexander Hamilton was born, and invariably, locals would direct them not just to the small house where he had lived, but also to Borden's general store, where they would hear the tale of kindness, credit, and a debt repaid across decades. The new trade route between Philadelphia and Charlestown brought more than just goods to Nevis. It brought stories, newspapers, and a growing awareness of the wider world. For William Borden, it also brought a steady stream of curious Americans, eager to see the store connected to Alexander Hamilton's childhood. And this is the very counter where young Alexander would stand, William explained to a group of American merchants. My father said he was barely tall enough to see over it, but he spoke like a grown man. The visitors nodded appreciatively, looking around the modest store with renewed interest. Did your father keep any of Hamilton's letters? One man asked. They might be quite valuable now. William shook his head. The only letter I have is the one he wrote to me, but it's not for sale at any price. After the Americans left, William's wife Martha approached him. You've told that story so many times now, I think you've added new details. William smiled. Perhaps a few, but the heart of it is true. "The Americans certainly love their Treasury Secretary," Martha observed, "though from the newspapers, it seems not everyone in their government agrees with him." Indeed, the American papers William received told of growing political battles between Hamilton and his opponents, particularly Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They criticized his financial plans as too favorable to the wealthy. Some even questioned his loyalty to America because of his foreign birth. One evening, as William was closing the store, a ship arrived in the harbor flying American flags. It wasn't the regular trading vessel which had visited just last week. Curious, William waited to see if any customers would arrive from this unexpected ship. Just before sunset, the bell above his door jingled. A well-dressed American entered, removing his hat. "Good evening," William greeted him. "Welcome to Borden's." "Thank you," the man replied, glancing around. "I'm looking for William Borden." "You found him," the man smiled. "Excellent. My name is Nicholas Kruger. I was Alexander Hamilton's employer on St. Croix before he left for America." William's eyes widened. "Mr. Kruger, Hamilton mentioned you in his letters." "Did he now?" Kruger seemed pleased. "I've just come from Philadelphia, where I saw him. He asked me to deliver something to you personally." From his coat, Kruger produced a sealed packet. He said it was too important to trust to the regular mail. William accepted the packet with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Is something wrong? Is Hamilton well?" "He's in good health, though working too hard as always," Kruger replied. "But there are political storms brewing in Philadelphia. Hamilton has made powerful enemies." After Kruger left, promising to return, the next day to hear more stories about Hamilton's youth, William closed the shop and hurried home with the mysterious packet. "What is it?" Martha asked, as William broke the seal in their small dining room. Inside was a letter and a document bearing official seals. William read the letter first. "Dear William, my friend Nicholas Kruger, who once gave me my first opportunity as a clerk in his counting house, has agreed to deliver this packet to you personally. Recent events in our government have made me reflect on the uncertainty of political life. While I continue to enjoy President Washington's confidence, the opposition to my financial programs grows stronger daily. I do not know how long I will remain in office or what turns my life may take in the years ahead. This uncertainty has prompted me to settle certain personal matters that are dear to me. Chief among these is my connection to Nevis and to your family, which represents one of the few positive memories of my childhood. The enclosed draft for £50 is an additional token of my gratitude. Unlike my previous payment, this is not meant as settlement of any debt, but as a gift to you and your family. I know from your letters that recent hurricanes have affected trade on the island, and I hope this modest sum might ease any difficulties you face. I have also enclosed a document establishing a small trust fund with the Bank of the United States. This fund will provide for annual payments to be sent to you for the purpose of extending credit to families in need in Charlestown, just as your father once extended credit to my mother and me. It is my hope that this fund will allow you to show kindness without financial risk, perpetuating the generosity your father showed when I was a desperate child. Finally, I must ask a favor. The political battles I fight are often vicious, with opponents attacking not just my policies, but my character and origins. Should anyone visit Nevis seeking information about my mother or my birth, I trust you will speak only the truth, but with the discretion and compassion your father showed to those in difficult circumstances. With deepest gratitude, Alexander Hamilton. William stared at the bank draft and the trust document in disbelief. £50 was more than his store earned in 3 months. And the trust fund, it was an extraordinary gesture. "What does it say?" Martha asked, seeing her husband's stunned expression. William passed her the letter. As she read, her eyes widened. "This is incredibly generous," she said finally. William nodded, still processing the magnitude of Hamilton's gift. "Far beyond anything my father did for him." "But that's the point, isn't it?" Martha said thoughtfully. "Your father's small kindness meant everything to a desperate child. Now that child has grown to have power and means, and he's multiplying that kindness many times over." In the days that followed, word spread through Charlestown about Hamilton's generosity to the Borden family. Some were skeptical, others impressed. A few families who had fallen on hard times cautiously approached William about credit arrangements backed by Hamilton's trust. Remembering his father's example, William established fair terms and kept careful records, just as Thomas would have done. The store began to serve an even more important role in the community, becoming not just a place to buy goods, but a source of help during difficult times. One afternoon, a woman entered the store with 3 small children. Her clothes were worn but clean, her manner proud despite obvious hardship. "Mr. Borden," she said quietly, "I'm told you might help with credit for necessities. My husband was lost at sea last month." William recognized the echo of Rachel Hamilton in this woman's dignity amid desperation. "Of course, ma'am. Let me explain our arrangements." As he helped her select flour, salt fish, and other basics, William felt a deep satisfaction. The cycle that had begun with his father and young Alexander had come full circle. That evening, he wrote a letter to Hamilton describing how the trust was already helping families in Charlestown. He included stories of specific individuals changing their names for privacy, knowing that Hamilton would appreciate the real impact of his generosity. William ended the letter with a personal invitation. "Should you ever find yourself able to return to Nevis, my home and store would be honored to welcome you. The island has changed little since your childhood, but I believe you would find that the kindness you remember from my father lives on in many ways." As he sealed the letter, William wondered if Hamilton would ever actually return to his birthplace. From what the newspapers reported, the Treasury Secretary was entangled in increasingly bitter political battles. Would he ever find the time or opportunity to revisit the humble island where his remarkable journey began? Little did William know that his letter would arrive in Philadelphia during one of the most challenging periods of Hamilton's career, a time when memories of Nevis and thoughts of returning to simpler beginnings would hold particular appeal for the embattled founding father. Alexander Hamilton sat alone in his office, a stack of newspapers spread before him. The headlines were harsh. "Hamilton's bank scheme threatens republic." "Jefferson condemns Treasury plan." Questions raised about Secretary's loyalty. The political battles had grown more personal lately. His opponents no longer just attacked his ideas. They questioned his character, his motives, even his American patriotism because of his foreign birth. Hamilton rubbed his temples. At 41, he sometimes felt much older. The long hours, constant writing, and political fights were taking their toll. He glanced at a small portrait of his wife Elizabeth and their children on his desk, reminding himself why he continued these exhausting battles. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. His assistant entered with the day's mail. "These just arrived, sir, including a packet from Nevis." Hamilton's expression brightened slightly. "Thank you, James." After his assistant left, Hamilton opened William Borden's letter first, setting aside official correspondence from Congress and various banks. As he read about how his trust fund was already helping families in Charlestown, a rare smile crossed his face. William described a widow with 3 children who reminded him of Rachel Hamilton. The parallel wasn't lost on Alexander, who remembered all too well what it meant to watch his mother struggle to feed her children. When he reached William's invitation to visit Nevis, Hamilton paused. He hadn't set foot on his native island since Leaving as a boy. The idea stirred complicated feelings, memories of poverty and shame mixed with flashes of beauty. The blue Caribbean waters, green mountain slopes, and the simple kindness of people like Thomas Borden. Hamilton picked up a blank sheet of paper and began to write. Dear William, your letter arrived at a most opportune moment, finding me surrounded by political storms that make me question whether my efforts here are bearing fruit. To read of the tangible good being done in Charlestown through the Trust brings me a satisfaction that political victories rarely provide. I was particularly moved by your account of the widow and her children. My mother faced similar circumstances, as you know. I have often wondered how different our lives might have been had more people shown the kindness your father extended to us. Your invitation to visit Nevis touches me deeply. I confess, I have avoided thoughts of returning, as my memories of the island are complicated by hardship. Yet lately, I find myself remembering not just the difficulties, but also the beauty of Nevis. The morning light on Nevis Peak, the scent of the sea, the simple dignity of island life. While my duties currently prevent travel, I have spoken with my wife Elizabeth about the possibility of a journey to the West Indies when my term of service concludes. She has expressed curiosity about the place where I began my life's journey. Until such time as I might return in person, I wish to strengthen our connection in other ways. I have arranged with several booksellers to send quarterly shipments of books to your store, some for sale, others specifically for your children. Education was my escape from poverty, and I would be pleased to contribute to the learning of Nevisian youth, beginning with your family. I have also enclosed a small portrait miniature of myself, recently painted at my wife's insistence. It is not vanity that prompts me to send it, but a desire that your children might connect a face to these letters from across the sea. Finally, I hope you will indulge me by sharing more memories of your father. Though my time with him was brief, his example of integrity and compassion has influenced me more than he could have known. Did he speak of me after I left? Did he follow news of America's Revolution? What brought him joy in his later years? Your friend, Alexander Hamilton. As Hamilton sealed the letter, he realized how much this correspondence with William had come to mean to him. In a life now filled with political alliances and strategic relationships, this connection to Nevis represented something pure, a reminder of who he had been and the values that had guided his improbable rise. 2 months later, William Borden received Hamilton's letter along with several crates of books. The portrait showed a handsome, serious man with intelligent eyes, not the desperate boy William's father had known. Yet somehow William could see traces of that determined child in the Treasury Secretary's face. That Sunday after church, William invited several families to his home, including the widow he had mentioned in his letter to Hamilton. As they gathered in his small parlor, William shared Hamilton's letter and showed the portrait. He remembers the islands with fondness, William told them, and he hasn't forgotten what it means to struggle here. The widow, Mrs. Parker, studied the portrait. It's hard to believe that a man now so powerful once stood in our shoes. That's why he understands, William replied. He hasn't forgotten what it's like to need help. In the months that followed, Hamilton and William exchanged more letters. William shared stories of Thomas Borden's later years, how he had continued helping those in need, how he had followed news of America's fight for independence with great interest, and how he had occasionally mentioned that bright Hamilton boy, and wondered what had become of him. Hamilton, in turn, shared more personal stories of his rise in America. He told William how he had arrived in New York with little more than his intelligence and determination, how he had joined the Revolutionary Army to fight for his adopted country, and how he had caught the attention of General Washington, who became his mentor. He wrote of his marriage to Elizabeth Schuyler, daughter of a prominent New York family, and of their children. He described the Constitutional Convention, where America's new government was formed, and his role in writing the Federalist Papers to persuade states to ratify the Constitution. These were not the carefully crafted political narratives Hamilton shared in public, but honest reflections on his journey, including doubts and struggles along the way. In William Borden, Hamilton had found someone connected to his past who could understand the distance he had traveled, not just in miles, but in station and circumstance. One letter contained a particularly personal confession. "There are times, William, when I wonder if I have traveled too far from that boy your father knew. The political world requires a hardness that doesn't always sit well with me. I find myself defending economic systems that seem far removed from the simple kindness your father showed when extending credit to those in need. Yet I believe there is no contradiction. The financial systems I've built for America aim to create prosperity that lifts all boats, to ensure fewer families face the desperation my mother and I once knew. Credit, properly managed, can be the bridge between present hardship and future opportunity. Your father understood this when he gave my mother the means to feed her children despite having no immediate funds. That lesson in economics and humanity has guided my work, though few of my colleagues would understand the connection." As William shared these insights with his neighbors and customers, Hamilton's story became a source of pride and inspiration for many on Nevis. Children listened wide-eyed to tales of the island boy who had risen to help build a new nation. Parents pointed to Hamilton as proof that circumstances of birth need not determine one's future. For William, the correspondence brought unexpected business opportunities as well. American merchants, learning of his connection to Hamilton, sought him out as a trading partner. The store expanded, adding a second floor and hiring additional clerks. In one letter, William described these developments. "Your friendship has brought prosperity to my family beyond anything I could have expected. The trust you established continues to help those in need, while our association has attracted business that allows me to employ several islanders who previously struggled to find work. It seems the cycle of kindness your mother and you received from my father has multiplied many times over. From a few shillings of credit has grown a web of opportunity touching many lives. My oldest son, Thomas, named for my father, has developed a particular interest in your letters. At 16, he shows an aptitude for numbers and trade that reminds me of stories my father told about you. He helps manage the store accounts and has begun corresponding with merchants in America. Perhaps someday he might visit your country? I would be proud to send him with an introduction to the man who has shown such generosity to our family." When Hamilton received this letter, he immediately wrote back with an invitation for young Thomas Borden to visit Philadelphia and stay with his family. The son of Thomas Borden would be welcome in his home any time. The connection between the Roe founding father and the Nevisian shopkeeper had grown into something neither could have predicted. A friendship spanning the sea, connecting two worlds, and touching lives across generations. By 1797, Alexander Hamilton had resigned his position as Treasury Secretary and returned to New York to practice law. After years of political battles in President Washington's cabinet, he welcomed the change. Though no longer in government, he remained influential, advising Washington and writing frequently on political matters. One spring morning, Hamilton sat in his New York law office reviewing documents when his clerk brought in the mail. Among official correspondence was a letter bearing the now familiar handwriting of William Borden. Hamilton opened it first, eager for news from Nevis. "Dear Alexander, I hope this letter finds you well in your new life outside government. The newspapers that reach us speak of your continued influence, though you've left official service. I write with exciting news. My son Thomas has completed his apprenticeship in trading and bookkeeping. With your kind invitation in mind, I have arranged passage for him to New York this summer. If your offer still stands, he would be honored to visit you and your family before establishing business connections in America. Thomas has grown into a fine young man of 18, with a head for figures that would make my father proud. He has read all your letters so many times that I believe he knows them by heart. Charlestown continues to flourish with the trade connections you helped establish. The trust fund you created has now assisted 15 families through difficult times, all of whom have repaid their debts when able, a testament to both your generosity and the dignity of our island's people. There is much excitement here about your stated wish to visit Nevis someday. Many who remember stories of young Alexander Hamilton can scarcely believe that the same person might return as one of America's founding leaders. With warm regards, William Hamilton smiled as he finished the letter. After setting it aside, he picked up a fresh sheet of paper and wrote to William, confirming that young Thomas would be welcome in their home for as long as he wished to stay. That evening, Hamilton discussed the upcoming visit with his wife Elizabeth. "Betsy, you remember I've told you about the Borden family of Nevis?" Elizabeth nodded as she worked on her embroidery. "The shopkeeper's son, who corresponds with you. His father extended credit to your mother." "Yes, his son Thomas will be visiting New York this summer." Hamilton paused. "I've invited him to stay with us." Elizabeth looked up. "Of course he must stay here. I'd like to meet this young man." Hamilton smiled at his wife's immediate generosity. "There's something else, Betsy. I've been thinking about visiting Nevis, perhaps next year, when the courts are not in session." Elizabeth set down her embroidery. "You've never shown much interest in returning before." "I know. For many years, I wanted to leave those memories behind." Hamilton gazed out the window. "But my correspondence with William has helped me see that not all my memories of Nevis are painful, and I find myself wanting to see it once more, to walk the streets of Charlestown as the man I've become, not the boy I was." Elizabeth studied her husband's face. "I think it would be good for you, Alexander, and I would like to see where your extraordinary journey began." 3 months later, a tall young man with tanned skin and intelligent eyes arrived at the Hamilton home in New York. Thomas Borden carried letters from his father and small gifts from Nevis, island rum, spices, and a carefully packed piece of sugarcane for the Hamilton children to taste. "Welcome, Thomas," Hamilton said, greeting him warmly. "Your father has told me much about you." "The honor is mine, sir," Thomas replied with a slight bow. "Your story has inspired many on Nevis, but none more than me." During Thomas's month-long stay, Hamilton introduced him to prominent merchants and bankers in New York. The young man's knowledge of Caribbean trade impressed these businessmen, and several offered him positions. Hamilton also spoke often with Thomas about Nevis, asking detailed questions about changes to the island and the condition of places he remembered from childhood. He seemed particularly interested in hearing about Borden's store and the house where he had lived with his mother. "The store has expanded considerably since my grandfather's time," Thomas explained. "My father has added a second floor with offices for merchants to meet and arrange trades." "And what of the house where Rachel Hamilton lived with her sons?" Alexander asked quietly. "It still stands, though it's weathered many storms. My father has ensured it remains marked as your childhood home. Some visitors to the island ask to see it." One evening, as they sat in Hamilton's study, Thomas gathered his courage to ask a question. "Sir, do you truly intend to return to Nevis someday?" Hamilton nodded. "I do. I've spoken with Mrs. Hamilton about making the journey next year. I find myself increasingly drawn to the idea of seeing Charlestown again." "It would mean the world to my father," Thomas said earnestly. "And to many on Nevis," Hamilton smiled. "I look forward to it myself, perhaps more than I expected to." After Thomas Borden returned to Nevis with promises of business partnerships established in New York, Hamilton began making concrete plans for a visit to his birthplace. He wrote to William, "My dear friend, your son has returned to Nevis with my highest regard. He is a credit to your family and will surely succeed in his commercial ventures. I have introduced him to several associates who recognized his abilities immediately." During Thomas's visit, I found myself speaking more of Nevis than I have in many years. Through his eyes, I saw the island not as a place of hardship, but as the beginning of a journey that has taken me farther than I could have imagined. Therefore, I am pleased to tell you that I have begun arrangements for a visit to Charlestown. I plan to sail from New York next spring, accompanied by my wife Elizabeth and perhaps one or two of our older children. I have secured passage on a merchant vessel that will allow us to stay on Nevis for 3 weeks before returning. While 3 decades have passed since I left the island, I find myself increasingly eager to walk its shores again as a man rather than a desperate boy. I look forward to meeting you in person after these years of correspondence and to seeing your father's store, now yours, where this remarkable connection between our families began. With anticipation, Alexander Hamilton, when this letter reached Charlestown, William Borden could scarcely contain his excitement. He shared the news with friends and neighbors, and soon the whole island was buzzing with the prospect of Alexander Hamilton's return. William began making preparations immediately. He renovated the guest room above the store, ordered new furniture from America, and began collecting items from Hamilton's youth. Old newspapers, books similar to those Rachel Hamilton had owned, even a ledger showing his father's original entries about the Hamilton family's debt. The prospect of Hamilton's visit became the talk of Charlestown. Local officials discussed how to properly honor such a distinguished visitor. The governor planned a formal reception. Shopkeepers spruced up their buildings. Children practiced songs to perform for the famous founding father who had once been a boy on their island. William wrote back to Hamilton, "My dear Alexander, your news has brought joy not just to me, but to all of Charlestown. Everyone from the governor to the dock workers speaks of your planned visit. You will find a warm welcome awaiting you here. I have begun preparing accommodations worthy of you and Mrs. Hamilton. Though we cannot match the luxury you surely enjoy in New York, we will do our best to make your stay comfortable. There is one matter I should mention. Several older islanders who remember your mother have expressed a wish to meet you. Would this be agreeable? I understand if such meetings might stir difficult memories. We are counting the months until your ship arrives in our harbor. After decades of correspondence, the thought of welcoming you in person to the store where you once stood as a boy is almost overwhelming." Your friend, William Hamilton's reply, confirmed that he would be pleased to meet anyone who remembered his mother, adding that time had softened the pain of those memories. In New York, however, new political complications began to arise. President John Adams, who had succeeded Washington, was increasingly at odds with Hamilton despite both being Federalists. Hamilton's criticism of Adams's policies had created tensions within their party. Additionally, Hamilton's old nemesis, Aaron Burr, was gaining political power in New York. Their rivalry, which had begun years earlier, showed no signs of abating. Despite these distractions, Hamilton continued planning his Nevis trip. speaking of it often to his family and friends. He seemed drawn to the idea of reconnecting with his beginnings at a time when political life in America was becoming increasingly fractious. As the planned departure date approached, however, a crisis emerged. The tensions with France had escalated, and President Adams called Hamilton back to help organize a possible military response. Though no longer in government, Hamilton's influence and expertise were still needed. With great reluctance, Hamilton wrote to William, "My dear William, it is with sincere regret that I must postpone our planned visit to Nevis. Political developments here require my attention in the coming months, making travel impossible at present. Please know that this delay does not diminish my desire to return to Charlestown. I have merely deferred this journey, not abandoned it. I propose instead that we look toward the following spring for my visit. Please extend my apologies to all who have made preparations. I particularly regret disappointing you after our long correspondence has built such anticipation. I remain determined to walk the streets of my birthplace once more and to shake your hand in the store where your father once showed kindness to a desperate boy. Your disappointed but determined friend, Alexander Hamilton." When this letter reached Nevis, William tried to hide his disappointment as he shared the news with the island. "Just a postponement," he assured everyone. "He still intends to come next year." The islanders accepted this news with understanding. They would continue their preparations and simply wait a bit longer for their famous son to return. Little did any of them know that events were unfolding in America that would make this promised visit increasingly difficult to fulfill, and that would ultimately turn their anticipation to grief. July in Charlestown was always hot, but William Borden found the heat especially oppressive that morning in 1804. He stood behind the counter of his store, tallying the week's sales in his ledger, when he heard excited voices outside. The mail packet had arrived from America. William smiled, wondering if there might be a letter from Hamilton. It had been several months since his last correspondence. Each time Hamilton had postponed his visit to Nevis, William had assured the islanders that the famous founding father would eventually return. Though privately, he had begun to wonder if Hamilton would ever find the time to revisit his birthplace. The bell above the door jingled as his son Thomas rushed in, his face strangely pale despite the heat. "Father," he said, holding a Philadelphia newspaper, "there's terrible news from America." William felt a chill despite the warm air. "What is it?" Thomas laid the newspaper on the counter. The headline stood out in bold black letters, "Hamilton dead after duel with Burr." William's hands shook as he picked up the paper. The words blurred before his eyes as he tried to read the account. Alexander Hamilton, shot in a duel with Vice President Aaron Burr at Weehawken, New Jersey, lingered for a day before succumbing to his wounds, died on July 12th. All of New York in mourning. "No," William whispered. "This can't be true." But the details were too specific to doubt. Hamilton was gone, killed in a duel with the man his letters had sometimes mentioned as a political rival. The founding father would never return to Nevis. The promised visit would never happen. News of Hamilton's death spread quickly through Charlestown. By evening, a somber group had gathered at William's store. Old men who claimed to remember the boy Hamilton, fishermen who had heard stories of his rise in America, women who had repeated the tale of Thomas Borden's kindness to their children, all came to share their grief. William closed the store early but left the doors open for those who wished to gather. Someone brought bottles of rum, and they raised glasses in Hamilton's memory. He never forgot where he came from, William told the crowd. Even at the height of his power in America, he remembered Nevis and the people here. In the days that followed, William found himself telling the story of Hamilton even more frequently. Visitors to the island, hearing of the connection between the store and the late founding father, sought William out to learn more. William ordered black cloth from a passing merchant ship and draped it over his store's sign. The governor proclaimed a day of mourning for the island's most famous son. In the small church where Rachel Hamilton had once prayed, a memorial service was held, with William asked to speak about the man he had come to know through years of correspondence. Alexander Hamilton left Nevis as a boy with nothing, William told the gathered islanders. Yet he carried with him qualities that cannot be measured: intelligence, determination, and a sense of honor that never allowed him to forget a debt, whether of money or gratitude. 3 weeks after learning of Hamilton's death, William received a visitor. A tall man in clerical clothes entered the store late one afternoon. "Mr. Borden?" the stranger asked. "My name is Benjamin Moore, rector of Trinity Church in New York City." William stared at him. "You've come from New York?" "Yes. I was with Mr. Hamilton during his final hours." Reverend Moore's voice was gentle. "Mrs. Hamilton asked me to visit Nevis on my journey to the southern colonies. She wished me to bring you something personally." The Reverend placed a small wooden box on the counter. "Mrs. Hamilton thought you should have this." William opened the box with trembling hands. Inside was a letter bearing Elizabeth Hamilton's seal, a leather-bound book, and several legal documents. "I'll leave you to read Mrs. Hamilton's letter privately," Reverend Moore said. "I'm staying at the inn by the harbor. Perhaps we might speak tomorrow." After the clergyman left, William closed the store and took the box home to read its contents with Martha. Elizabeth Hamilton's letter was written in a graceful hand. "Dear Mr. Borden, though we never met, I feel I know you through my husband's many letters and the stories he shared of your correspondence. Alexander spoke often of his wish to return to Nevis and of his friendship with you, which he valued greatly. In his final weeks, as political storms gathered around him, he spoke more frequently of Nevis, not as a place of hardship as he sometimes described it in earlier years, but as the beginning of a journey that shaped him in essential ways. Through enclosed volume of the Federalist Papers was my husband's personal copy. He had set it aside specifically for you with the inscription you will find on the first page. He wished you to have this record of his contribution to our nation's founding. Also enclosed are documents establishing a permanent trust fund for the education of children in Charlestown, with particular attention to orphans and those of limited means. Alexander instructed that this fund be named after your father and administered by your family for generations to come. He often told our children the story of Thomas Borden, who fed a hungry boy when others turned away. That man, he would say, taught me more about credit and trust than all the bankers in Europe. If you would receive Reverend Moore, he was with Alexander at the end and carries a final message that my husband asked to be delivered personally. With deepest gratitude for your friendship to Alexander, Elizabeth Hamilton, William opened the book of Federalist Papers with care. On the first page, in Hamilton's distinctive handwriting, was written, "To William Borden, son of the man who fed us when we were hungry. May the principles of good governance outlined in these pages help ensure that fewer children face the hunger and hardship I once knew. Your friend, always, A. Hamilton." Martha wiped tears from her eyes. Even at the end, he remembered. The next morning, William met Reverend Moore at the harbor. They walked along the shore, the blue Caribbean waters sparkling in the sunlight. "I was with Mr. Hamilton after he was brought back to New York from the dueling ground," Moore explained. "He lived for about 30 hours after being shot." "Was he in much pain?" William asked quietly. "Yes, considerable pain, but his mind remained clear." Moore looked out at the sea. "He received communion from me, and expressed forgiveness toward Colonel Burr. He was at peace with God at the end. They walked in silence for a moment before Moore continued. The night before the duel, Mr. Hamilton wrote several letters. One was addressed to you, but he never completed it. Mrs. Hamilton found it among his papers. Moore handed William a folded paper. This is not the letter itself, which Mrs. Hamilton has preserved, but a copy of what he had written. William unfolded it with care, my dear William. Tomorrow morning I face a matter of honor that may well prove fatal. Though I have no desire to leave this world and those I love, I find myself compelled by circumstance to risk my life in a manner I cannot avoid without sacrificing principles I hold dear. Should the worst occur, I wish you to know that among my regrets would be never returning to Nevis to thank you in person for your friendship. Our correspondence has meant more to me than you perhaps realize, providing a connection to beginnings I once sought to forget, but now value as formative. Tzadar, debt I incurred as a boy in your father's shop was the first of many in my life, but perhaps the most significant. From it, I learned that credit is a form of trust between people, a lesson that guided my design of financial systems for our new nation. I have instructed my wife regarding certain bequests I wish to make to Charlestown. It is my hope that the Hadim letter ended there, unfinished. He was called to his family after writing this much, Moore explained. He never returned to complete it. William carefully refolded the paper. Thank you for bringing this to me. There is one more thing, Moore said. A message Mr. Hamilton asked me to deliver verbally. The clergyman's voice grew softer. In his final hours, when he knew he was dying, he spoke of various regrets. Among them, he mentioned never returning to thank the Borden family in person. He told me, "Tell William that the first debt I ever incurred for food when my family was starving was the one that taught me the true meaning of credit, honor, and trust." Moore reached into his pocket, and he asked me to give you this. He placed a small, worn pocket watch in William's hand. It was his personal timepiece, Moore explained. He carried it daily. William examined the beautiful silver watch, engraved with Hamilton's initials. Open it, Moore suggested. William carefully opened the watch's back panel, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a faded, worn piece of paper, folded many times until it was barely larger than a coin. With trembling fingers, William unfolded it. It was a receipt from Thomas Borden's shop, dated 1767, written in his father's handwriting. It listed basic provisions, flour, salt fish, beans, and noted credit extended to R. Hamilton. William turned the paper over. On the back, in Hamilton's Tuatsif handwriting, were the words, "The debt that formed me, paid in full, but never forgotten." For a moment, William couldn't speak. Alexander Hamilton, founding father of a new nation, Treasury Secretary, statesman, and author, had carried this small receipt from a Nevis grocery store his entire adult life. He kept this with him always? William finally asked. Moore nodded. According to Mrs. Hamilton, he transferred it to each new watch he acquired throughout his life. She had never seen it until after his death, when she found it while gathering his personal effects. William stared at the small piece of paper. This tangible connection between a desperate orphan boy and the great man he had become. The simple receipt represented a circle completed, a debt honored not just with money, but with a lifetime of remembrance. That evening, William placed the watch and receipt in a small display case in his store, alongside Hamilton's book and portrait. In the days that followed, islanders and visitors alike came to see these treasures and hear the story of the boy from Nevis who never forgot a debt. The trust fund Hamilton established became known as the Thomas Borden Memorial Scholarship. For generations, it would help bright children from Nevis receive an education they could not otherwise afford. Some would go on to prominence in the Caribbean, others to opportunities abroad. All would hear the story of Hamilton and the shopkeeper who extended credit when it was needed most. William often stood before the display case in quiet moments, looking at the worn receipt his father had written so many years ago. What Thomas Borden had seen as a simple act of kindness, soon forgiven and forgotten, had rippled through time to touch countless lives. "The debt that formed me," William murmured, reading Hamilton's words again. In that moment, he understood that the true legacy of his father's kindness wasn't measured in shillings and pence, but in how it had helped shape a boy who would go on to help shape a nation. The greatest debt, William realized, had been paid not in money, but in the example Hamilton set, of remembering one's beginnings, of honoring obligations both financial and moral, and of extending to others the same hand that had once helped lift him from desperate circumstances. In this way, the connection between a small Nevis grocery store and one of America's founding fathers would continue to inspire generations on both sides of the sea. A reminder that acts of kindness, even small ones, can change the course of history, one life at a time. Thanks for joining me till the end. Let me know in the comments from where you are tuning in. Drop your city and country name in the comments. Also, make sure to subscribe to this channel if you love Lewis Hamilton. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed this heartwarming story of friendship and second chances. See you in the next one.